Sometimes the events of life can feel like we're sitting on a roller coaster. Up and down, up and down. And after a while, we begin to feel quite sick. There are all sorts of challenges that can come into our lives. There are high moments, there are low moments. Certainly our lives can be peppered with a lot of variety when it comes to challenges. And one of the temptations for us is, as we go through challenging times, as we go up and down on the roller coaster of life, we may know as the people of God that God is sovereign, that He is in control, and that He does care. But we are tempted in the midst of those hardships, while we are waiting to see the unfolding of His plan, particularly when we are in the midst of what we could call a hard providence, to try to fix things. At our initiative, we have ideas of how things should work out. We have examples of this in Scripture, of course, where things did not work out well, but ultimately the divine purpose of God still unfolded. Think of Abraham and Sarah. God had made a promise to this couple who had been married and for many years were unable to have children. God told them that He would bless them. He would provide them with an offspring. And from the offspring of Abraham and Sarah, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. But years went by, there were no children. So they decided to scheme and plot. They decided to plan. And as a result, great devastation came. The Lord's will was still fulfilled, but there was pain along the way. When we are on the roller coaster of life in the midst of difficulties, it is very tempting for us to say, let me put my hand into the ring. Let me fix this situation up. And isn't it true, you often look back and think, what was I thinking? That could have gone really bad. But sometimes you see the restraining grace of God preventing things from being as bad as they could. I know that this will sound repetitious, but if you study Ruth, there is repetition you have to deal with. It is the repetition of knowing that all things in this world are ordered by the sovereign hand of God. And we will do well to look carefully that even when we're on the roller coaster, in the highs and the lows, when we are in the midst of a providence, whether it be a happy providence or a hard providence, the signature of God's sovereign hand is on everything. The sovereign purpose of God, remember, reaches all people, all places, and all particulars. This is what brings me to Ruth chapter 3. Ruth chapter 3 begins and ends with a very interesting contrast. In fact, this chapter is tense. You're supposed to be sitting on the edge of your seat as you read Ruth chapter 3. We've kind of reread this chapter in my observation of some commentators to somewhat sanitize some of the things going on in this chapter. But I think we need to let the text speak. The author wants you to feel awkward as you go through this chapter. He wants you to sit on the edge of your seat this morning and say, what is going on here? This chapter begins in verses 1 through to 5 with a risky plan. But it ends with a rewarding provision. How do you go from a risky plan where everything could have fallen apart, it had the potential for it, to the most rewarding provision? The answer is found in what lays between the risky plan and the rewarding provision. There is the repetition of a key word that is found 6 times, at least in various forms, in the middle section of Ruth chapter 3. What is this word that is repeated? It is the word Redeemer. The only reason why there is a rewarded provision is because of the Redeemer found in the middle of the passage. So this morning, I have 3 points, and these are based on 3 scenes that are actually found in Ruth 3. And you'll see this pattern throughout the book of Ruth. We're moving now to the 3rd major scene, which is chapter 3, and this scene is divided up into 3 parts. First of all, we're going to see the risk, and that is tense. Then we're going to see the Redeemer. That is triumphant. And then we're going to finally see the reward. So let's jump into this story. Let's go way back to this ancient time in the little town of Bethlehem, where we are learning about 2 women, Naomi and Ruth. The bottom of their world had fallen out. Naomi was married to a man by the name of Elimelech. And this couple had 2 sons. A famine had come into Bethlehem. And as a result of this time of hardship, Elimelech decides to take his family out of Bethlehem and to leave the house of bread, which is the name of Bethlehem, and go to a place where there is bread, and that was Moab. As they go to Moab, his sons marry Moabites. But then suddenly, and remember, we're only in the first 5 verses of the book here, everything just falls apart. Elimelech dies. Her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, die. Ruth is left by herself, and she only has her 2 daughters-in-law. Her world had fallen apart. She truly is the female Job. What a horrible scenario she was in. Things are bad. But as she found herself in this situation, she heard the news that God had visited Bethlehem. There is now bread in the house of bread, and she decides to go back. For there is no hope for her to stay back in Moab, and her 2 daughters-in-law begin to follow her on this journey. But then suddenly Naomi stops and says to her girls, listen, the prospects are not good for you if you come with me. It is best that you stay. You are Moabites. You are going to be viewed as outsiders. You're not going to have high chances of remarrying. There are no children that I can provide. And even if I could, you're going to have to wait a long time before they grow up and you marry them. It's just not going to happen. Girls, go home. Now, of course, they display their loyalty, their desire to follow her. But then Naomi is insistent upon this, that you must stay. You cannot come. Orpah kisses her, but we remember that Ruth clings to her. She is not going to let her go. And there in that defining moment, in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 16, she declares publicly, your God shall be my God. Your people will be my people. That is her public declaration that I am now a child of the living God. I will be a part of the covenant community of Yahweh's people. I am affirming that Yahweh is the one true God. That was an amazing moment, and she went back to Bethlehem with her. Now, we learnt last time in chapter 2 that Ruth, showing great initiative and care toward her mother-in-law, went out into a field. And we recall that the law of Moses provided a way for those who were vulnerable, those who were poor, those who were widows, to be provided for, in which where there was a field, the field owner was not to reap everything. They were to leave a portion for the vulnerable and the poor and the childless and the widow to go to that place and to take from that field. And we are told in an amazing turn of events that Ruth just happened to have landed on the field of a man by the name of Boaz, who just happened to be the relative of Elimelech. Now, this is what brings us to this passage. The passage begins with a risk. It's seen in the first 5 verses. Naomi speaks to her daughter-in-law and says, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you that it may go well with you? You're a good girl. You're loyal. And I don't want you to end up alone. I don't want you to be the one who is just having to care for me. I want you to be looked after. In other words, I want you to marry. Now, since Ruth had come back with a bag of grain last time, provided to her by Boaz, this has got Naomi thinking. Now, as you read carefully into this text, you begin to see that Naomi was quite the character. An industrious woman, a woman who liked to make plans, a woman who has seen the need for a couple of people to come together in marriage. She is an ancient Israelite matchmaker. And what she says to Ruth here is a very interesting question. Is not Boaz our relative? She knows that. Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? Ruth, can I remind you that you've been doing some work in the field of Boaz? He's related to us. And the very fact that he's related to us implies that he has the capacity to be somebody that can provide for this family according to Jewish customs. Naomi then goes on to say, see, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now, this very brief statement tells us that Naomi is across a lot of things. She's been keeping an eye on Boaz. She knows his habits. She knows the roads he drives home on. She knows what time he's home. She's keeping her eye out. A very industrious woman. She knows what is going on. And as much of a surprise as all of this may be for Ruth, Naomi has it all worked out. Boaz is our relative. He's going to be home tonight, and he is going to be at the threshing floor threshing the grain. She then instructs Ruth to change her appearance. I want you to go home. I want you to wash. I want you to anoint yourself, and I want you to put on a cloak and go down to the threshing floor. Now, the whole idea of the instruction here is this. I want you to convey that you are no longer in mourning. I want you to convey that a new chapter is beginning in your life. Now, I don't think we need to read into the cloak. Some people have sort of got the idea here that Naomi is saying, look, I want you to get your best perfume, put it on, put your makeup on, wear a wedding dress, and knock on Boaz's door. The word cloak here just simply refers to a heavy garment. If you have a look at the text, she's supposed to go there at midnight. So this is actually a very practical suggestion that I want you to wear a garment that's going to keep you warm, but I do want you to show that you are no longer in a state of mourning. So clearly there is something in mind behind this plan. She goes on to say that I want you to go to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to him until he has had a good meal. He's probably been busy out in the field. Let him relax. Let him have his meal. Let him have his drink. And once he's sitting back and falls asleep upon that big pile of grain, that's when you make your move. It's strategic. There's a lot of planning going on here, but I want you to see this is risky. This actually looks like something where, as a reader, you should be saying, am I somehow to be reading into this, and am I missing something? Because this doesn't sound very good. This sounds a little bit risque. What's going on? Well, we continue to read in the text. She says in verse 4, but when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and then he'll tell you what to do. Naomi has hatched this scheme. This is her plan. Now let me just tell you what her big picture is. Naomi wants these two to get together. She wants them to get married. She wants a new beginning for her. She wants Ruth to be at rest. But the way Naomi goes about it is she creates a plan, she plots a scheme that could put Ruth and Boaz at huge risk. After all, you remember what we read in the previous chapter when Ruth gave the news that Boaz lets me work in the field among the other young women. Naomi responded back in verse 22, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest another field you be assaulted." There are some bad people out here in Bethlehem. Remember chapter 1 and verse 1, this was in the time of the judges, where everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. This was a terrible time to live. So you don't send a young lady out at midnight without being protected. This is a risky plan. But this is what's going on. Naomi, for reasons that we don't ultimately know, we don't have all the facts, but what we just see here in the text is a plot that is risky, and to say the least, rather questionable. She is to go at midnight, and not only that, she is a Moabite. The Moabite women had a reputation that if they were to be seen wandering at night, something highly inappropriate was about to happen in that house. So if Ruth was caught, seen in this, she could be charged by committing the act of sexual immorality and be stoned. If Boaz was to be accused of anything, his reputation would also be tarnished and things would not go well with him. I don't want to read too much into the text. We need to just read what is here. But my conclusion in these first 5 verses in this scene is something that should make you feel a little bit tense. Is this a good idea, Naomi? Is this how you really go about this plan? It's risky. This is what brings us to the next passage. And that is the scene 2, beginning in verse 6, and it's the Redeemer. We read in verse 6, "So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her." She arrived, she saw the place where Boaz had had his meal. He finished eating, he drank, he was merry, he fell asleep. Everything is happening just like Naomi said. When this happens, we are told that he lies down at the end of the heap of grain. And Ruth quietly approaches Boaz. And approaching this sleeping man, she uncovers his feet. A huge garment was placed upon him, and lifts his feet, she lays down. Now, some people at this point will ask the question, is there something going on here that we're not aware of, like some special custom? I would like to say there is, because that would make this sound really a good way to go about things, but there is no such custom mentioned in the Bible. This is a strategic risk to lift up the garment so that his feet are exposed, resulting in something very simple. He gets cold feet. Cold feet before a proposal. This is what's going on here. This is just a very simple plan, yet a risky one, to wake him up, and then suddenly presented in front of him is his future bride. Will this work? Risky. Well, we're told at midnight, as his feet had then been exposed, the cool wind blowing through Bethlehem comes into the area where he was threshing and then sleeping, and suddenly he wakes up and he looks up, and lo and behold, there is a lady at his feet. "Hello, who are you?" says Boaz. Now, it's interesting that he knew it was a woman, because if you look at this in the Hebrew, he uses a feminine term. But what he distinctly says is, "Who are you?" "I don't know who you are, lady. This is not where you belong. I was sleeping, and what are you doing here? It's the middle of the night." But suddenly, the response comes. "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Now, this is interesting. We're going to learn a few things about Ruth and Boaz here, but what I want you to see is you will only see the significance of that statement if you remember what Boaz said to Ruth back in chapter 2 and verse 12. Quickly go back there. After Boaz had discovered that Ruth, the lady working in his field, was the relative of Naomi that displayed loyalty toward her and had left Moab and come to Bethlehem, and this outsider has now come among the people of God, he said to Ruth in the field, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." In other words, Ruth, you could have done anything you wanted, but you chose to find safety under Yahweh's wings. May the Lord reward you. And Ruth remembered that. And what Ruth is saying in essence is, Boaz, I'm Ruth, I'm your servant. Remember you prayed that God has taken me under his wings, and you pray that he would repay me? Would you be those wings? Would you be the answer to your own prayers? This is more than a Christian pickup line. This is an amazing statement of amazing godliness recognized in the life of Boaz. What is this saying about Ruth? Put aside for a moment the risky scenario that Naomi has asked for Ruth to be in. We learn something, first of all, about Ruth in this statement. The very fact that she said, "I am Ruth, your servant, spread your wings over your servant," shows that she is a submissive woman. She is a woman who is saying that as a wife, I call upon my husband to protect me. I call for him to lead. I call for him to cherish me, to love me. She is the Proverbs 31 woman. She is affirming the biblical design of a protective, leading, faithful, loving man. She is displaying this, but in addition to that, she is also showing herself to be steadfast, because she goes on to say, "I ask for all of this because you are a redeemer." How does that make her steadfast? Well, this is where I have to give you a little bit more detail in terms of a cultural custom. A cultural custom that was built into the law of God in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verses 5 to 10, is you have this beautiful provision of a redeemer. A redeemer, by definition, was a relative, a close relative, who had the responsibility to make sure that the vulnerable in the family who cannot be provided for would be provided for. A redeemer had all sorts of responsibilities. One of them was to avenge the death of an innocent party. Another one was to look after the social welfare of an individual. If a husband died and the property was in jeopardy, he was to buy that property so that the family could still live in it. That was the role of a redeemer. But the way it worked was the closest member to the individual that passed away was the one who had the first right of responsibility for that particular task of redemption. Boaz is a relative of Elimelech, and he qualifies to be an individual that can redeem. But the interesting thing is, when you carefully read the stipulations of the law of God in the book of Deuteronomy and also Leviticus, you discover that it was binding upon the brothers. But upon the other relatives, it wasn't binding. In other words, Boaz is not actually obligated to fulfill this task. And that is important. He is not actually obligated. But Ruth appeals to him and says, you are a redeemer. But how does this show her to be a steadfast woman? What she is actually declaring there is, as a redeemer, you are to purchase the land that Elimelech owns so that Naomi will be provided for, and then as a result, I will also be provided for because you will be my husband. But she here is thinking about Naomi. Naomi didn't tell her to say this. Ruth is saying this. And Boaz gets it. Look at his response. After Ruth declares that I am your servant and I want you to place your wings over me. In other words, I want you to marry me, but you are a redeemer. I want you to look after Naomi. He responds in verse 10, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. What was the first kindness? The first kindness was chapter 1. He goes, I remember that you left Moab to support Naomi. You left what could have been your best life now in order to serve the one true God at much sacrifice. You gave up everything so that you could be loyal to Yahweh and his people. And he goes, I remembered that. But this second act of kindness, you have come here to ask for my hand in marriage, which was not a cultural norm, so that Naomi would be looked after. You are an amazing woman, Boaz says. The godliness of Ruth just beams, and Boaz sees it. And he even gives us the indication that he was a fair bit older than Ruth. He's saying, you're a young woman. You could have gone after the young guys, but you chose me. Blessed be you, he says to her. What does this say about Boaz? Well, we're going to see a few other things about him in just a moment, but the first thing we learn about Boaz in this passage is that he is a principled man, a righteous man. Now, you think about this risky situation that he has been placed in. I know we can very easily sanitize this and make it all very innocent, but this is a very vulnerable position to be put in. This is not a good position for the two of them to be put in, where she lifts up a blanket after he's had a merry meal, and she is very well presented, and she is laying at his feet. We know what the lusts of the flesh will be crying out what to do. But if you read carefully in this text, Boaz shows himself to be a righteous man. He shows amazing restraint. He shows himself to be principled, and it's very interesting that there is a Hebrew word that is often used to ask a person to lie down, and it will have a sexual connotation. Boaz distinctly uses a word saying, look, you can't go home because it's going to put you at risk. If people see you leaving this house at this time of night, this is not going to go well with you or for me. You must stay. But he uses the word, you need to not lie, you need to lodge. It is very distinct in the Hebrew text. It is showing that there is nothing inappropriate going on here at all. Despite the fact that Boaz has been put in an awkward position, Boaz reveals that he is a man of principle, a man of righteousness. This is the type of redeemer you want to cover you with his wings. Then we also see that he is not only a principled man, he is a protective man. Let's have a look at the flow of the text. Verse 11, and now, my daughter, do not fear, for I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true, I am a redeemer. Yet there is a Redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. The very fact that he's getting her to stay and makes it very clear to her, I just want you to stay here for the night, is the protection that he is showing her. This Redeemer is not only a righteous Redeemer, a Redeemer who is principled, who will stand committed to the task of integrity and obedience to the law of God. He is also a Redeemer that is protective. But in addition to that, he is a providing Redeemer. He says to her, yes, I will do it. Yes, I do, to the question. I will marry you. And he even at the end of the text gives her a large amount of grain to take home as, I think, somewhat of a down payment. But it's interesting that a complication comes up. In the midst of all this excitement, Boaz shares the news, but there's actually another relative who's closer to Elimelech, and really, he has the first right of refusal. If he's willing to buy the property, if he's willing to marry you, then that's a good thing. But if not, I'll make it happen. He is a man who wants to protect. He is a man who wants to provide. What a redeemer this is. Well, after all of this, we come to the final scene, and that is the reward. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. I want you to see the integrity there. I want you to see the purity there. We go on to read, and he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she brings it out and she presented it to him, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. Now I want you to note that if you look at the measurements of this is a really heavy pile of barley. This is not just a little trip with a couple of bags from the supermarket that she has to carry home. She has got a lot of barley here. And this here, I want you to see this very carefully. At the end of Ruth 1, there is a reference to a barley field. At the end of Ruth 2, there is reference to barley in Ruth's hand. And what you see here at the end of Ruth 3 is more barley, but the barley is getting bigger. The supply is getting more. And what I want you to see here in the text is a subtlety of God's sovereignty. Remember I said last time, the signature of God's sovereign hand is on everything. It's just we're often too busy to see it. But sometimes God puts his signature on things in bold print. And that's what it is here. She can't help but see the goodness of God in this. She is carrying this big load of barley all the way back. And I love what happens when she rocks up home. Have a look at what it says in the text. And I'm going to translate it differently to the English Standard Version. We read, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, who are you, my daughter? She didn't ask, how did you fare? How did it go? She's actually saying, who are you, my daughter? She knows it's Ruth, but she's asking the same question that Boaz had asked. She's basically saying, are you a new woman now? Are you Mrs. Boaz? But as she sort of comes through the front door with this big pile of barley and dumps it on the bench, she says, well, this is what he gave me. These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Is that a message to Naomi? I think it is. This lady who created a pretty questionable and even risky scheme was the very lady that said at the end of chapter 1 when she got back to Bethlehem that I have come back empty. And what does Boaz do when she creates this scheme. He doesn't follow all the things that Naomi had suggested. He went around things in a very righteous way, and we're going to see in the next chapter, he's actually going to deal with the situation publicly in the very next chapter, but he's sending a message back to Naomi saying, your hands aren't empty. They're not empty. You've got barley. But there is something else in this gift. I do see here a pledge, a down payment, that where possible, I am going to see to it that I can redeem Ruth. She replied to this, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. She sees that he is a man of his word, and he's going to get on this. It's interesting that all of a sudden Naomi, who was very big on wanting to act, who was very big on wanting to scheme, suddenly is saying, let's wait. God is in this. God is at work. So even in a situation that could have ended quite badly, it could have ended very badly for Ruth, it could have ended very badly for Boaz, in the end, the purpose of God unfolded. And what we're learning here is the providence of God is over all things. It is over all people. It is over all places. It is over all particulars, but it's even over silly things we do. Even when we make mistakes, we're never out of the sovereign hand of God. That doesn't remove our responsibility. That does not remove our responsibility to repent. But what it does do to us is help us rest under the safe wings of our mighty God. Before I bring us to our close, I want us to be reminded of a very important principle that is here in this text, and I want to particularly call out to those that are yet to marry and desire to marry. We live in a culture that calls for you to fulfill your own desires. It calls for you to go from one person to another person. But I want you to see in this text an honorable man and an honorable woman. As these two come together in a questionable scenario, they display absolute righteousness. Boaz shows true love toward Ruth by not taking advantage of her, but by displaying righteousness and holy restraint. He actually recognizes what a wonderful woman Ruth is by calling her a worthy woman. And by the way, that's the same phrase in the Hebrew of Proverbs 31:10 of the virtuous wife. And I happen to think that Proverbs 31 was actually written about Ruth. What you have here is two godly individuals. They could have all of a sudden said, well, let's just make this happen. But if they did, David would have never been born. There is bigger implications to that, and we'll see that next time. But as they honored God, God had honored them. Ruth was a woman of God. Boaz was a man of God. And we need to remember that this is the call for us. I also want to remind married couples that here we have the portrait of what a godly husband and wife are. Boaz is the picture of a man who loves with a steadfast love. He is conveying the qualities of protection and provision. You go over to Ephesians 5 and there you learn that a godly husband loves his wife with sacrifice. He loves his wife with sensitivity. He loves his wife with a security. He loves his wife with a sanctifying love. But as we bring this chapter to a close, here we see a passage that begins with a risky plan, ending with a rewarding provision. How did a risky plan go to a rewarding provision? The answer is found in a redeemer. No ordinary redeemer, a relative who was principled and righteous. A relative who displayed the qualities of provision and protection. if we are ever going to find ourselves in a situation in which we need to find safety, we will do well as the people of God to find ourselves under the wings of such a Redeemer. And I have good news. There is a Redeemer that all of us can find safety under. This Redeemer is righteous. This Redeemer is our relative, for he is called our brother. This Redeemer provides. And this Redeemer will protect and never let his people go. Who is this Redeemer, you ask? There is a Redeemer, Jesus, God's own Son, precious Lamb of God, Messiah, Holy One.